You expect me to pay $200 for this dump? On a windy Tuesday afternoon in Red Willow, Wyoming, Serena Vale, the ice-cold CEO of a Denver aerospace company, slapped the invoice onto the counter of a cracked roadside garage. Across from her stood Caleb Rourke, a grease-stained single father who had just repaired her broken luxury SUV in less than an hour. His 9-year-old daughter Mara froze behind the counter. Serena looked at the dusty floor, the abandoned grain elevator outside, then at Caleb's worn-out hands, and laughed, like his dignity was worth less than the oil on his shirt. She said a place like this didn't deserve her money, climbed back into her repaired SUV, and drove away without paying $1. Caleb didn't chase her. He didn't shout. He simply placed one hand on his daughter's shoulder and said, "Some people don't know what a man is worth until it costs them everything." But Serena didn't know someone had watched the whole scene from a gray sedan across the street. And by tomorrow morning, Caleb Rourke's quiet name would make her entire empire tremble. If you're new here, this channel tells stories about real human character, the kind that doesn't show up on a resume or a bank statement. If that's something you want more of, consider subscribing. It means a lot, and it helps us keep going. Red Willow, Wyoming was the kind of town that didn't show up on anyone's travel plans. It sat low between wide fields of dry wheat, cut through by a single main road, and a rail line that maybe saw 2 freight trains a week. The grain elevator on the east end had been shut for years. The diner still worked, the barbershop still worked, and Rourke Auto Works still worked, mostly because Caleb Rourke made sure it did. 6 days a week, whether the work was there or not. He had taken over the garage from a retired mechanic named Dale Huffman 8 years ago, back when the building still had a functioning lift and a coat of paint that hadn't started peeling. The lift still worked, though it groaned on cold mornings. The paint was long gone. Caleb had stopped noticing. What he noticed were engines. The way a diesel knock differed from a timing issue. The way a fuel system running lean sounded almost like breathing through a clogged nose. He had spent so many years listening to machines that he could walk into a bay, let a car idle for 30 seconds, and already have a narrowing list of likely problems in his head. It wasn't a gift, it was repetition, patience, and the willingness to keep looking when other people had already decided there was nothing to find. His daughter Mara had grown up in that garage. At 9 years old, she could hand him the right wrench without being asked, and she knew better than to stand behind a running engine. She did her homework on a folding table near the office window, the one that looked out over the grain elevator in the road, and when business was slow, which it often was, she'd watch the trucks go by and make up names for the drivers. Caleb had never planned to raise her alone. His wife Claire had been diagnosed 2 years after Mara was born, and spent the next 5 years fighting something that didn't care how good a person she was. When Claire died, Mara was 7. Caleb opened the garage the following Monday because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. The work helped not because it made him forget, but because it required his full attention. A car didn't care that you were grieving. It needed fixing or it didn't run. That kind of honesty suited him. He charged fair prices, sometimes less than fair. A school teacher with a cracked radiator hose got a discount because Caleb knew she drove 40 minutes each way and couldn't afford a week without a car. A farmhand with a failing alternator was told to pay when he could. An elderly woman named Ruth Garner, who came in every spring for an oil change, paid exactly what the oil cost because Caleb had decided a long time ago that Ruth Garner was not someone he was going to overcharge. The garage didn't make him rich, but it kept the lights on, kept Mara fed, and kept him honest. Most days, that was enough. The afternoon Serena Vale drove in, it was the kind of October day where the wind came sideways, and the sky looked like old pewter. Caleb was in the middle of a brake job on a delivery truck when he heard the SUV pull into the lot. A late-model Range Rover, charcoal gray. Out of place the way a dinner jacket would be out of place at a livestock auction. The woman who stepped out wore clothes that didn't belong in Red Willow either. Not flashy, she wasn't the type to perform wealth, but everything was precise. Tailored coat, clean leather boots, the composure of someone accustomed to running rooms full of people who did what she said. Caleb wiped his hands and walked over. She explained the problem with the clip deficiency of someone who had already wasted more time on this than she intended. The car had stalled 3 times on the interstate. 2 dealerships and a certified service center in Casper had all cleared it with no findings. She had a meeting in Cheyenne the following morning, and she needed the vehicle functional. Caleb asked her to pop the hood. He spent 20 minutes with the engine. He pulled the fuel system diagnostic, checked the injector pressure, and found the problem almost immediately. The fuel control module had been remounted incorrectly during the last service, creating an intermittent connection fault that only triggered under sustained highway load. Clean environments and short test drives wouldn't catch it. That was why 3 other shops had missed it. He fixed the mount, cleared the fault codes, took the Range Rover up and down the county road twice at speed to confirm the issue was resolved, and pulled back into the bay. Total time, 51 minutes. He wrote up the invoice at $213. Serena Vale looked at the number. Then she looked at Caleb. Then she looked around the garage, the stained concrete, the old lift, the pegboard of hand tools on the far wall, the hand-lettered sign above the office door that read, Rourke Auto Works, established 2014. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You're charging $213, she said, "for less than an hour of work?" "I'm charging for the diagnosis," Caleb said. "The hour is just how long it took me to do what 3 other shops couldn't." She set the invoice back on the counter. Her voice stayed level, the way someone's voice stays level when they believe they are correcting a misunderstanding rather than starting an argument. A garage next to an abandoned grain elevator doesn't charge $213. Caleb didn't move from where he was standing. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at her steadily and said, "Ma'am, the invoice is on the counter." Serena picked up her keys, walked to her Range Rover, and drove out of the lot without paying. Mara had been at her homework table the whole time. She came to stand beside her father in the doorway, and they both watched the dust settle back onto the road where the SUV had been. The wind was still coming sideways. Nothing else had changed. "Why didn't you stop her?" Mara asked. Caleb looked down at his daughter. She wasn't crying. She was just watching him, waiting to understand what this moment meant. "Some people think money makes them bigger than other people," he said. "But the only thing we ever really control is what kind of person we decide to be." Mara thought about that for a moment. Then she went back to her homework. Caleb picked up the invoice from the counter, folded it once, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he went back to the delivery truck. The brake job wasn't going to finish itself. What Caleb didn't know was that a man named Graham Vale had been sitting in a gray sedan across the road for the better part of an hour. Graham was 67 years old and had more money than he would ever spend. Something he thought about with more discomfort than most people assumed. He was the founder of Valeon Aerotech, a company he had built from a 2-room engineering office in Denver into one of the more significant aerospace technology firms in the American West. His name was on the building. His decisions shaped the careers of thousands of people. He had not always been this man. He still drove alone sometimes, not because he had to, but because he had learned early that you saw the world differently when you were the one behind the wheel. No assistant preparing your perspective. No briefing materials telling you what to notice. Just the road and whatever was actually there. He had come through Red Willow because the town sat adjacent to a parcel of land that Valeon's real estate division was evaluating. He had planned to drive through, make some notes, and continue south to Cheyenne. Then he saw the Range Rover pull into the garage beside the grain elevator. He recognized the car because he had bought it. He recognized his daughter by the way she carried her shoulders when she was irritated. He watched the whole thing through the windshield. He watched Caleb go under the hood. He watched him take the car out and bring it back. He watched the invoice exchange, and he watched Serena's face when she set it back on the counter. He was too far away to hear the words, but he had been in enough rooms to read posture. He knew exactly what that expression meant. He had worked hard for years to make sure his daughter never became the person who wore it. He wondered now when he had stopped paying attention. When Serena drove away, Graham's gaze moved to the man still standing in the doorway. He watched Caleb look down at the small girl beside him. Watched him say something. Watched the girl nod and go back inside. Then Caleb went back to work. No phone call. No chase. No scene. He simply absorbed the injustice and kept moving with the quiet dignity of someone who had decided long ago what kind of person he was going to be, and wasn't going to let anyone else's behavior renegotiate that. Graham sat in the sedan for another few minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called Nolan Pierce, who had been his personal attorney for 19 years and knew better than to sound surprised by anything Graham said. "I need you to look into someone," Graham said. "His name is Caleb Rourke. He runs a garage in Red Willow, Wyoming. I want to know who he is when no one's watching. Talk to the people in this town. Find out what they say about him when he's not in the room." "What am I listening for specifically?" Nolan asked. "You'll know it when you hear it," Graham said. "Or you won't find it, and that'll tell me something too." He set the phone down, started the engine, and pulled onto the main road, heading south toward Cheyenne. He passed the grain elevator, past the garage, past the light burning through the dirty window of Rourke Auto Works. Inside, Caleb was already back under the delivery truck, working by feel in the dim light, doing the thing he did every day. Nolan Pierce arrived in Red Willow the following Wednesday morning, driving a rented Ford pickup. His assistant had suggested a sedan. Nolan had been to enough small Wyoming towns to know that a sedan made people guarded, and a truck made them talk. He started at the diner on Main Street, ordered coffee and eggs, and mentioned to the woman behind the counter that he was passing through thinking about the area. Had heard good things about a mechanic named Rourke. The woman, her name was Patty, and she had worked that counter for 22 years. Didn't look up from the coffee pot. "Caleb's the best thing in this town that doesn't grow out of the ground," she said. "My transmission went out 2 winters ago. I had $40 to my name until the following Friday. He fixed it, told me to pay him when I could, and never mentioned it again." Nolan didn't take notes. He had learned that a notepad made people feel like they were giving a deposition. He spent the rest of the morning moving through the town the way water moves through a landscape, finding the low points, the places where people gathered. He sat with a retired Army sergeant named Douglas Hale, who lived at the edge of town and kept 3 dogs and a vegetable garden. Douglas had been missing VA appointments in Casper because his truck had thrown a rod. Caleb had sourced a used engine, installed it over a weekend, and charged only for the parts. "He told me his labor was free because I'd already paid enough," Douglas said, looking at some point past Nolan's shoulder. Said it like it wasn't even a decision. A young woman named Brianna Walsh, who drove a school bus and worked evenings at the only bar in town, told him that Caleb had fixed her brake lines the previous spring and refused full payment because he knew she was saving for her daughter's asthma medication. A farmer named Earl Stanton said that Caleb had once driven 15 miles in a snowstorm to jumpstart a combine so Earl could finish harvesting before a front moved in, and had asked for nothing except a cup of coffee. By late afternoon, Nolan had spoken to 11 people. He had not steered a single conversation. He had simply said Caleb's name and gotten out of the way. Every story was different: the vehicle, the season, the particular hardship. But the shape of each story was the same. Someone had needed help. Caleb had helped. He hadn't made a production of it. He hadn't mentioned it later. He had simply moved on to the next thing that needed fixing. That evening, Nolan called Graham from his motel room. "I talked to 11 people today," he said. Not one of them used the same words, but they all described the same man. He leaned back in his chair. In my experience, when a story is that consistent across that many independent sources, it stops being a story. It's just who someone is. Graham was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything that cuts against it?" "Nothing," Nolan said. And I looked. Graham thanked him and told him to stay in town through Friday. Caleb knew nothing about any of this. His week continued the way his weeks always did. A rancher brought in a diesel pickup with a failing fuel injector. A young couple from 2 towns over came in with a minivan that was overheating. Walt Greer, who had been coming to Rourke Auto Works since the beginning, needed rear brake pads and spent 45 minutes telling Caleb about his grandson's baseball team while the work was being done. Caleb listened to all of it. On Thursday evening, Mara reminded him about the school trip. She brought it up the way she had learned to bring up things that cost money, carefully watching his face while she talked. A field trip to the Science Museum in Cheyenne, $82. Permission slip due by Friday. Caleb smiled and told her he'd have it sorted by morning. After she went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his bank statement and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The numbers didn't have much give in them. The rancher's job had paid well, but the parts cost had eaten most of the margin. He moved figures around in his head until he found a path that worked, then wrote a check for $82 and set it beside his keys. He didn't spend much time thinking about Serena Vale. The $213 would have helped, but it wasn't going to break him. What stayed with him, the thing he couldn't quite put down, was the expression on her face when she looked around his garage. Not anger, not guilt, just a flat, effortless assessment. The look of someone who had decided, without much deliberation, that he wasn't worth the basic transaction of human respect. He had seen that look before. It never got easier. But he had learned that how you responded to it mattered more than the look itself, especially when someone small and watchful was standing nearby, learning what the world was and how you were supposed to move through it. He rinsed his coffee cup, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. Graham returned to Red Willow on Friday, this time without his convoy. He drove the gray sedan himself, parked down the block from the garage, and spent the morning simply watching from a distance, standing at the edge of the hardware store parking lot with a paper cup of coffee, observing through the open bay doors. He saw Caleb reduce the bill for a young mother whose sedan had a failing alternator. She had a toddler in the back seat and the expression of someone who had run out of options before she arrived. Caleb wrote, the invoice quoted her a number, and then, when she handed over her card, he told her he'd made a mistake on the parts cost, and the actual total was $40 less. It wasn't a mistake. Graham had been close enough to see him write the original number. He watched Caleb help a delivery driver who came in frantic about a brake issue on a tight deadline. Caleb said he could do it in 40 minutes and finished in 38. When the driver tried to press extra cash into his hand as a tip, Caleb shook his head. "I did the job I was asked to do," he said. The driver looked at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. He watched Caleb handle a customer who was wrong about what was wrong with his truck. a man who arrived loud and certain and walked him through the actual diagnosis in a way that left the man's dignity intact. No visible satisfaction at being right, just the facts, offered quietly so the man could reach his own conclusion. Each moment on its own was unremarkable. Together, they were something else entirely. That evening, Graham called Serena from his hotel room in Cheyenne. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice carried the particular evenness she used when she thought he was being unreasonable and had decided to let him speak before saying so. "I heard you had someone looking into the mechanic from Red Willow," she said. "I did," Graham said. "Over $213. Not over the money." Graham looked at the window, at the dark outside it. "The money was just the moment I happened to be watching." He let that settle, then said, "There was a man who helped me once, about 40 years ago. A mechanic. I was 24, driving a car that barely ran, on my way to a job interview that turned out to change everything. The car died on the road, and he stopped, fixed it, and waved off the money. Told me to get going before I was late. He stopped. I never got to thank him properly. By the time I had the means to find him, he was gone." The line was quiet. "I've spent 40 years thinking about what 20 minutes of someone else's decency was worth," Graham said. "Not to me. I know what it was worth to me. I mean, what it cost him. It cost him almost nothing. It was just who he was." He set down his glass. "That's what I saw in Red Willow, Serena. That's all." His daughter didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was slightly different, flatter in the way that meant something had landed. "What are you planning to do?" "I'm going back Monday," he said. "I'll tell you after." Graham had been building the Red Willow Trades Trust for years, a community fund designed to provide vocational training, emergency support for working families, vehicle assistance for veterans, and scholarships for young people in small towns who had ambition but no infrastructure around them. He had the capital. He had the legal framework drafted and revised over several years by Nolan's firm. He had a clear vision for what the fund was meant to do and who it was meant to serve. What he had never found was the right person to run it. Not an administrator in the conventional sense, someone who could manage a budget and file quarterly reports. He needed someone who would be trusted by the exact population the fund existed for. Someone who understood scarcity not as a concept, but as a daily condition. Someone whose instinct, when faced with a person in need, was not to build a process around them, but to simply help them. He had looked for years. He had sat across from nonprofit professionals who used the word impact so many times it had lost all meaning. He had watched executives talk about community investment over dinners where the wine cost more than some of his grant recipients made in a week. He had never found the person. Until Red Willow. On Monday morning, a line of black vehicles pulled into town and stopped in front of Rourke Auto Works. Red Willow noticed immediately it was not a place where things went unobserved, and a convoy of black SUVs was not something it had seen before. By the time Graham walked through the garage door, 3 people were already watching from across the street. Caleb was under a truck when he heard the footsteps on the concrete. He rolled out on the creeper, stood up, and found a man in his late 60s standing in the middle of the bay. Gray coat, plain shirt, dressed without performance, but carrying the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in every room and no longer needed to announce it. Caleb recognized him. He had seen the name Vale enough times in the past week to have looked it up. Graham set a large envelope on the workbench. "My daughter didn't pay you $213, he said. "That's not why I'm here. I'm not here to settle her account." He nodded toward the envelope. I've been building something for a long time, and I've been looking just as long for the right person to build it with. I'd like you to open that." Caleb pulled off his work gloves and picked up the envelope. Inside was a check for $21 million, made out to the Red Willow Trades Trust, and a founding document 40 pages thick with Caleb Rourke listed as executive director. He set the check down on the workbench, then set it down again more carefully, as if the first time hadn't counted. He looked through the office window at Mara sitting at her folding table with a book open in her lap, her back to the bay, unaware that anything had changed. "I'm a mechanic," Caleb said. Graham looked at him steadily. "Yes," he said. "I know exactly what you are." Caleb didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table after Mara went to bed, the founding document spread open in front of him under the overhead light, and read it the way he read technical manuals, slowly, looking for the thing he might miss if he moved too fast. The language was precise and formal, full of terms he understood in outline, but not in detail. Fiduciary responsibility, executive oversight, programmatic deployment of capital. $21 million. He got up and made coffee he didn't need, stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark yard, and tried to locate the version of himself that was supposed to know what to do with this. He couldn't find it. What he found instead was the version that had written an $82 check for a school field trip and set it by the door so he wouldn't forget. He was not a man who doubted himself easily. He had learned through years of working alone on problems other people had given up on to trust his own judgment. But this was different. This wasn't a fuel system or a failing alternator. This was a structure designed to carry the weight of other people's lives. And if he got it wrong, it wasn't his car that wouldn't start in the morning. It was someone else's chance that wouldn't come. That thought sat in him like a cold engine refusing to turn over. By morning, the town already knew something had happened. Red Willow had no real mechanism for secrets. The black SUVs had been seen. Graham Vale's name had been searched on phones in the diner, the barber shop, the feed store. By midday, a reporter from a Cheyenne television station had parked outside the garage and was asking if Caleb had a statement. He told her he didn't, as politely as he could, and went back inside. The attention unsettled him for a specific reason. Not because he disliked people, but because the story the reporter wanted to tell was about a dramatic reversal of fortune. A working man suddenly elevated, and that wasn't what it felt like from the inside. From the inside, it felt like being handed a machine he didn't know how to operate, and being told clearly that it mattered very much that he not break it. He called Nolan Pierce that evening. Nolan listened without interrupting, while Caleb laid out his concerns. When Caleb finished, Nolan was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something that isn't legal advice?" Nolan said. "Go ahead." "I've worked for Graham Vale for 19 years. I've watched him make decisions involving serious amounts of money. He doesn't do things like this on impulse, and he doesn't do them to feel good about himself." Nolan's voice was measured the way it was in every conversation he had. "He watched you for 3 days. He had me talk to 11 people in this town. After all of that, you're the person he chose. I'd take that seriously." "I do take it seriously," Caleb said. "That's the problem." Nolan almost laughed. "That might be exactly why he picked you." After he hung up, Caleb went out to the garage. Not to work, he just needed to be somewhere familiar. He turned on the bay light, sat on an overturned crate near the lift, and looked at the tools hanging on the pegboard across from him. Every one had a specific purpose. Every one worked because it had been designed for a particular job and used correctly within its limits. He had spent 20 years learning which tool did what and why, and what happened when you forced the wrong one. He had not spent 20 years learning how to run a community fund. But he had spent 20 years learning how to figure out what was broken and fix it without making it worse. And sitting in the quiet of the garage under the single bay light, he began to think those might not be entirely different things. Mara found him there the next morning, earlier than she usually woke up. She came through the side door in her socks, her hair still flat from sleep, and sat cross-legged on the concrete floor beside his crate, the way she had been sitting on garage floors her whole life. She looked at the tools on the wall for a moment. "Are you going to say no?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Caleb said. "Is it because you're scared you'll mess it up?" "Partly," he said. She was quiet for a moment, thinking it through with the seriousness she brought to things that mattered. "You've never messed up someone's car," she said. "You fixed Mrs. Garner's car when 2 other guys couldn't. You fixed that lady's fancy car when 3 places couldn't figure it out." She looked up at him. "Why would this be different?" "Those are cars," Caleb said. Mara looked at the tools on the wall again. "You always say a car is just a problem waiting to be understood," she said. "Maybe this is too." He had no clean answer to that. And he knew, sitting in the quiet of the garage with his daughter in her socks on the cold concrete floor, that she had just said the thing he had been circling around for 2 days without being able to reach it himself. Graham came back Wednesday. He came alone, just the gray sedan, no convoy. He pulled into the lot, walked into the bay, and accepted the offer of a folding chair without ceremony. They sat across from each other, between the lift and the workbench, and Graham talked. He told Caleb about the mechanic who had stopped for him on a roadside in January 40 years ago. He told it fully: the 1991 winter, the Civic with the bad transmission, the interview suit worn twice already. He described pulling over with steam rising from under the hood and watching other cars go past without slowing. He described the older man in a work coat who stopped his truck, came around without much preamble, and spent 20 minutes with the engine. When it was running again, the man had waved off the money and told him to get going before he was late. Graham had tried to find him 2 years later, when he finally had money of his own. He learned the man had died in a workplace accident not long after that winter roadside. The debt had nowhere to go. "I've had 40 years to think about what those 20 minutes were worth," Graham said. "Not to me. I know what they were worth to me. I mean, what they cost him. They cost him almost nothing. It was just who he was." He looked at Caleb directly. "You're who he was. I've watched you long enough to be certain of that." Caleb turned a bolt over in his hand without looking at it, a habit he had when he was working something out. "I don't have experience running something like this." "I didn't have experience building an aerospace company," Graham said. "I had judgment and the sense to hire people who knew what I didn't. You'll do the same." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking you to become someone you're not. I'm asking you to do what you already do, with more resources and more people to do it for." Caleb set the bolt down on the workbench. He looked through the office window at the pale sky over the grain elevator. A habit now, looking through that window when he needed a moment to think. "I have conditions," he said. Graham nodded once. "Tell me." "The fund prioritizes working people. Families who are one broken-down car away from losing a job. Veterans who need transportation to get to their appointments. Young people who want to learn a trade and can't afford the training. Small towns that don't get the attention the big foundations give to cities." Caleb met his eyes. "No oversized administration. No expensive offices. The money goes to people, not to the structure built around people." Graham was quiet for a moment. "That is exactly what the founding document specifies." "I know," Caleb said. "I read it 3 times. Something shifted in Graham's expression, not quite a smile, but close to one. Caleb extended his hand, and Graham shook it, and that was that. Serena came 4 days later. She drove herself. No assistant, no preparation visible in her posture. She sat in the lot for a long moment before getting out of the car, which was the first time Caleb had seen her do anything that looked like hesitation. She was dressed plainly, dark jeans, a simple coat, hair pulled back without precision. She looked like a version of herself that hadn't been arranged for anyone. She set 2 things on the counter. The first was an envelope containing $213, with a note on the outside that read, "Plus interest, 30 days," written in her own hand. The second was a smaller, sealed envelope with his name on the front, written slowly and carefully. "You don't have to read it now," she said. "Okay," Caleb said. She looked around the garage, not the quick dismissive scan from her first visit, but the slower look of someone trying to see a place honestly. The tools on the pegboard, the old lift, the folding table by the window where a child clearly spent her afternoons. "When I came in here the first time," she said, "I made a decision about what this place was worth before I knew anything about it. About what you were worth." She met his eyes. "I knew I was doing it while I was doing it. That's the part I keep coming back to." Caleb watched her for a moment. She wasn't performing this. He could tell the difference. "You want to know something about this garage?" he said. "Every person who's come through that door with a problem, I've tried to fix it. Not because someone was watching, not because I was building anything, just because that's what the work is." He kept his voice even. "You didn't pay me. That's settled now. What matters more is what you do with the next person you're tempted to write off, before you know anything about them." Serena absorbed that without deflecting. "My father said something like that." "He's a smart man." She almost smiled, brief and a little unsteady, like something she wasn't sure she'd earned yet. "He is." She pulled her keys from her coat pocket. "I wanted to say this in person. That's all." "I appreciate that," Caleb said. She nodded once and walked back to her car. This time, when she pulled out of the lot, she went slowly. Caleb read the letter that evening after Mara was in bed. Serena's handwriting was careful and undecorated. It had the quality of something written more than once, revised down to what was true and nothing extra. "I looked at your garage and decided what you were worth before I knew a single thing about you. I've been trying to understand how I became someone who does that without noticing. I don't think I've finished figuring it out yet. But I wanted you to know that I see what I did clearly, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Below her name, she had added one more line. "My father was right about you." Caleb folded the letter and set it on the kitchen table. He sat with it for a while. Then he turned off the light and went to bed. The morning would come early. There was still work to do. The Red Willow Trades Trust opened on a Thursday in early March, inside a converted warehouse 2 blocks from the grain elevator. The building had sat empty for 6 years. When the renovation began, it smelled like dust and old timber. On opening day, it smelled like fresh paint and coffee, and the particular energy of a room where people have gathered because something real is beginning. Nolan Pierce stood in the front row, without his briefcase the first time Caleb had seen him without it. Douglas Hale, the retired sergeant, came in his truck and sat in the 3rd row, with his hands folded on his knees. Patty from the diner brought a foil tray of food and left it on the welcome table without making an announcement. Earl Stanton parked his farm truck across the street and stood outside because he said he wasn't much for crowds. But he stayed for the whole thing. Graham sat toward the back where he could see the full room. Serena sat beside him. When Caleb stood up to speak, he didn't have notes. He talked about the town the way someone talks about a place they intend to stay, accounting for it honestly, without decoration. He talked about what the fund was for and who it was for, and what it was not for. He said it all in the same plain language he used to explain to customers what was wrong with their cars. No flourishes, no promises he couldn't keep. Mara sat in the front row, holding a hand-painted sign she had made herself. The letters were slightly uneven, done freehand with careful effort. The sign read, "For people who need a fix." She had thought about it for 2 days and decided that was the most honest thing she could write. Caleb saw the sign from the front of the room and had to look at the ceiling for a moment to collect himself. After the event, when the room was thinning and people were collecting their coats, Mara found her father and took his hand. They walked out together through the front door, into the cold March air, and down the block toward the garage. The light was going gray and gold over the grain elevator. Their breath showed in small clouds. Caleb still had the garage. He still opened it at 7 every morning and closed it when the work was done. He still listened to engines the way other people listen to conversations, finding meaning in sounds most people ignored. That hadn't changed, and he hadn't wanted it to. What had changed was the radius of it. Behind them, the lights in the converted warehouse stayed on, throwing a long rectangle of yellow out across the sidewalk and into the street. A few people were still inside, talking over coffee, making plans. The building that had been empty for 6 years had in the space of one afternoon become somewhere. Caleb and Mara walked home through the early dark, and the light kept burning behind them, steady and plain, the way good things often are. Before we close, there's something worth sitting with. Caleb never set out to be noticed. He fixed cars, raised his daughter, and treated every person who walked through his door like their problem mattered. Not because he was building a reputation, but because that was the kind of man he had decided to be. And that's the thing about character. It doesn't perform. It just shows up day after day in the small choices no one's keeping score on. Whether you give someone a fair price when you could get away with more. Whether you stay patient when someone's being difficult. Whether you let your child watch you absorb an injustice with your dignity intact. Those moments feel small when you're living them. But they're the ones that define you, and sometimes they're the ones that change everything. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing it now. Every week we bring you stories about the kind of human character that doesn't make headlines, but shapes lives. We'd love to have you with us.